I texted the family group chat flight lands at 6 p.m. Can someone pick me up? I had just buried my husband overseas. My sister replied, "We are busy, try Uber." My mom added, "Why did not you plan better?" I simply wrote, "No worries." What they saw on the news that night made them drop their phones. My name is Kelsey, 33 years old, and I work as a management consultant in Seattle. Until a week ago, my life was filled with warmth, love, and the quiet security of a happy marriage. Then a sudden phone call from a hospital in Tokyo shattered my reality. My husband David had been on a short business trip. A massive heart attack took him from me before I could even board a flight to be by his side. I spent the next 5 days navigating foreign bureaucracy, arranging a cremation, and crying in a sterile hotel room completely alone. When I finally landed back at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, I was a hollow shell of the woman I used to be. My hands were numb, my eyes were swollen shut from crying, and my backpack held a heavy wooden urn containing the ashes of the man I loved more than life itself. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who underestimated your worth and treated your pain as an inconvenience. The terminal was a chaotic sea of rushing travelers and rolling suitcases. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a sickening intensity that made my temples throb. I pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders, shivering as the freezing drafts from the sliding doors bit through my thin clothes. Outside, the worst snowstorm of the decade was beginning to bury the city under a thick blanket of white. Flights were being canceled by the minute, and the lines for taxis wrapped around the building. My legs felt like lead. I had been awake for over 30 hours surviving on nothing but airplane water and overwhelming grief. I pulled out my phone and opened our group chat titled Family First. I typed the message with trembling thumbs. "Flight lands at 6 p.m. Can someone pick me up?" I watched the read receipts appear almost instantly. My sister Brittany, who was 35 and lived less than 20 minutes from the airport, was the first to type. Her response popped up on the screen, a jagged knife slicing right through my exhausted mind. "We are busy, try Uber." I stared at the words, waiting for a follow-up message. A joke, an apology, a promise to send her husband Colin instead. But nothing came. Then my mother Patricia chimed in. "Why did not you plan better?" My father Richard did not even bother typing a reply. He simply tapped the heart icon to like my mother's cruel message. I stood frozen in the middle of the crowded baggage claim. They knew exactly why I was in Tokyo. They knew I was bringing David home in an urn. They knew the weather was deteriorating rapidly. Yet picking up their widowed daughter was simply too much of an inconvenience. A dark curiosity urged me to open Instagram. I clicked on Brittany's profile, and there it was. Her profile picture had the glowing ring indicating a live story. I tapped it. The screen filled with the golden ambient lighting of Le Petit Chateau, one of the most exclusive and expensive French restaurants in downtown Seattle. Brittany was panning the camera across a table covered in oysters, caviar, and expensive champagne. In the background, I could clearly see my mother Patricia laughing, wearing her diamond necklace, while my father Richard ordered another bottle of wine from the sommelier. They were not busy with an emergency. They were not trapped in the storm. They had chosen to enjoy a lavish high-society dinner rather than drive 15 minutes to bring me home. This was not a new dynamic. Growing up, Brittany had always been the golden child, the one who married a wealthy finance executive, the one who gave my parents the country club image they so desperately craved. I was the independent one, the daughter who quietly paid her own way through college and married a kind, humble man instead of a billionaire. I was expected to manage my own crises gracefully and silently, so as not to disrupt their perfect aesthetic. I took a deep breath, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. I opened the group chat again. I simply wrote, "No worries." I shoved my phone into my pocket, adjusted the backpack containing my husband, and walked out into the freezing blizzard. I managed to secure an Uber after waiting for 45 grueling minutes in the freezing wind. By the time I climbed into the back seat of the car, a violent coughing fit had taken hold of my chest. The drive to my neighborhood took nearly 2 hours because the roads were slick with ice and abandoned vehicles. When the driver finally pulled up to my driveway, the snow was already ankle deep. I thanked him, tipped him generously, and trudged up the walkway to my front door. The house was pitch black. No porch light had been left on. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so violently I dropped them twice in the snow. When I finally pushed the front door open, a blast of air hit me. It was not warm, welcoming air. It was freezing damp and smelled strongly of mildew. I stepped into the foyer and my boots splashed into 2 inches of standing water. I gasped in shock, fumbling for the light switch on the wall. The hallway remained dark. The power was completely out on the ground floor. I waded further into the house using the flashlight on my phone to illuminate the devastation. The hardwood floors were ruined, buckled, and warped from the water. The expensive Persian rug in the living room was soaked through. Water was steadily dripping from the ceiling above the dining table. Before I left for Tokyo, my mother and father had explicitly promised to come by the house every other day to make sure the pipes did not freeze during the cold snap. Patricia had looked me in the eye and told me to focus on David, assuring me they would handle the house. They had never come. They had completely abandoned their promise, leaving my home to freeze and flood while they planned their fancy dinners. The cold inside the house was piercing, somehow worse than the blizzard outside. My teeth were chattering uncontrollably as I splashed through the kitchen searching for the emergency flashlights in the pantry. I needed to find the main breaker box in the basement to ensure the electricity was safely shut off before the water reached the wall outlets. I placed my backpack gently on the highest, driest shelf I could find. "I will be right back, David," I whispered into the dark room. I opened the basement door. The air down here was heavy, thick, with a strange metallic odor that I could not quite place. The wooden stairs were slick with water that had cascaded down from the broken pipes above. I gripped the handrail tightly, shining my phone light down into the gloom. The basement was flooded with at least a foot of freezing water. I took one step down, then another. My legs were trembling from sheer exhaustion and the biting cold. On the 5th step, my wet boot lost its grip on the saturated wood. My foot shot out from under me. I fell hard, tumbling down the remaining stairs. I crashed onto the concrete floor, the freezing water splashing up over my face and chest. My shoulders slammed into the edge of a heavy wooden work table. A sharp, blinding pain exploded behind my eyes as the side of my head struck the concrete. I let out a choked scream, clutching my temple. I tried to push myself up, but the room was spinning violently. The strange metallic smell in the air was growing stronger, making me dizzy and nauseous. It was the old gas fireplace on the ground floor. The pilot light must have gone out when the power failed, and the damaged pipes must have cracked the gas line. Carbon monoxide was quietly filling the enclosed space. I coughed, my lungs burning as I inhaled the toxic air. The freezing water numbed my limbs, making it impossible to coordinate my movements. I managed to drag myself up to the first step, my fingers weakly grasping the wooden railing. My vision started to blur at the edges, darkening into a narrow tunnel. I thought of David waiting in his urn upstairs. I thought of my family laughing over champagne while I died in a flooded basement. I could not let them win. I tried to scream for help, but only a weak rasp escaped my throat. My grip on the railing failed, and I slumped back into the freezing water. The darkness finally overtook me, pulling me down into silence. I do not know how much time passed. I woke to the sound of splintering wood and heavy boots splashing through the water. Bright beams of light swept across the basement walls. Strong hands grabbed my arms, lifting me out of the freezing water. Someone was shouting into a radio. I felt the bitter outdoor air hit my face as I was carried out of the house. I later learned that my next-door neighbor, an elderly man who was out shoveling his walkway, had noticed a steady stream of water pouring out from under my garage door. Knowing I was out of the country, he had rushed over and pounded on the front door. When he smelled the gas leaking through the cracks, he immediately called emergency services. The firefighters had to break down my front door to get inside, finding me unresponsive at the bottom of the basement stairs, just minutes before the carbon monoxide levels would have become fatal. I woke up hours later in a brightly lit room at the local hospital. The steady beeping of a heart monitor echoed in my ears. I was wrapped in thick heated blankets, and an oxygen mask was strapped firmly over my face. My head throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. A young nurse with kind eyes and a badge that read, "Nina," was checking the IV line in my arm. She smiled warmly when she saw my eyes open. "You gave us quite a scare, Kelsey," she said softly. "You have moderate hypothermia, a mild concussion, and carbon monoxide poisoning. But you are going to be okay." I tried to speak, but my throat was raw and painful. I weakly pointed toward the small table next to the bed where my belongings had been placed. My phone was sitting there, the screen lighting up continuously with incoming notifications. Nina noticed my gesture and handed the phone to me. I unlocked the screen. There were no messages asking if I was safe. Instead, the family group chat was filled with complaints. Brittany had sent a photo of a ruined designer shoe, complaining that the snowstorm had forced them to wait outside for the valet after their dinner. Patricia had complained that the restaurant ran out of her favorite dessert. Not a single word about my flight. Not a single question about whether I had made it home in the blizzard. I let out a bitter, exhausted laugh that turned into a painful cough. The phone slipped from my weak grip and landed on the bedsheets, the screen still illuminated, displaying the cruel messages from earlier. "We are busy. Try Uber. Why did not you plan better?" Nina leaned over to pick up the phone. Her eyes inadvertently caught the glowing text messages. She froze, reading the exchange. Her expression shifted from professional warmth to absolute disgust. She looked at me, then back at the phone. "Did your family actually send this to you?" she asked, her voice tight with suppressed anger. "Knowing you were flying back from your husband's funeral." I nodded slowly, unable to muster the energy to hide the truth. "They went to a French restaurant downtown," I whispered. "They promised to check my house while I was gone. They let the pipes freeze." Nina's jaw clenched. She set the phone down carefully. "I have been an emergency room nurse for 8 years," she said quietly. "I have seen a lot of terrible things. But abandoning a grieving widow in a blizzard while they drink champagne, that is a special kind of evil." She walked over to the door, checked the hallway, and then turned back to me. "Kelsey, there is a reporter from the local news station down the hall. They have been here all night covering the storm, interviewing people who got stranded or injured. They are looking for a story about how dangerous this weather is and how people need to look out for each other." She paused, looking at me with fierce determination. "I know this is highly personal, but people like your family get away with this behavior because they operate in the shadows. They hide behind closed doors and perfect public images. If you are willing, I can bring that reporter in here. You do not have to show your face. We can blur your name. But people need to see exactly what happens when vanity is prioritized over human life." I lay there staring at the sterile ceiling tiles. My whole life I had protected my family's reputation. I had stayed silent when my mother mocked my career choices. I had smiled politely when Brittany belittled David for not making enough money to afford a yacht. I had absorbed their toxicity to keep the peace, believing that eventually they would show me the love I craved. But David was gone. And I had almost died on a freezing basement floor because my own parents could not be bothered to miss a dinner reservation. "Bring the reporter in," I said, my voice gaining strength. "Let us show everyone exactly who they are." 10 minutes later, a cameraman and a reporter were standing beside my hospital bed. They agreed to keep the camera angled, so my face remained in shadow, focusing mostly on my hands, clutching the hospital blanket. I told them everything. I spoke about the 30-hour journey from Tokyo carrying my husband's ashes. I spoke about the freezing Uber ride, the flooded house, the broken promises, and the descent into the basement that nearly cost me my life. Then I handed the reporter my phone. He scrolled through the group chat, his eyes widening in disbelief. He asked permission to film the screen, assuring me he would blur the names to protect my identity, though the content of the messages would be fully visible. I gave him full permission. At 10 o'clock that night, the local news broadcast went live across the entire state. The anchor sat at the news desk with a grave expression. The banner at the bottom of the screen read, "Widow survives flooded home after family abandons her in blizzard." The anchor's voice filled the hospital room. Tonight, a story of incredible survival and heartbreaking betrayal. While Seattle residents braved the worst blizzard of the decade, a young widow returning from her husband's overseas funeral nearly froze to death in her own home. But the real tragedy is why she was left stranded in the first place. The screen cut to the blurred footage of my phone. The cruel text messages were displayed in stark high definition for the entire state to read. "We are busy. Try Uber. Why did not you plan better?" The reporter's voiceover continued. These were the messages sent by her immediate family members who, according to social media posts, were dining at a luxury restaurant in downtown Seattle at the exact moment their daughter was stepping into the storm with her husband's ashes. The family had also promised to winterize her home during her tragic trip, a promise they abandoned, leading to burst pipes, a gas leak, and a near-fatal rescue. The segment lasted 4 minutes, but it hit with the force of a wrecking ball. The reporter did not reveal my name, nor did he name my family members. But in the tight-knit, status-obsessed circles of Seattle's elite country clubs, secrets do not stay secret for long. People talk, people connect the dots. People remember who was dining at Le Petit Chateau that night while their daughter was flying home from Tokyo. 30 minutes after the broadcast aired, my phone, which had been silent all day, began to vibrate violently on the tray table. The screen lit up with incoming calls, one after another. It was a relentless assault of notifications. I picked up the phone and looked at the caller ID. It was Brittany. She called 3 times in a row. When I did not answer, she left a voicemail. I tapped the icon and brought the speaker to my ear. "Kelsey, what the hell is wrong with you?" Brittany was screaming into the phone, her voice shrill and panicked. "Did you actually go to the news? Are you out of your mind? Do you know how many people from the country club board watch that station? Caroline from the fundraising committee just texted me asking if the story was about us because she saw our dinner photos. You are trying to ruin my life. Call me back and fix this right now. You tell them they got it wrong." The voicemail ended. The phone immediately vibrated again. This time it was my mother, Patricia. I listened to her message. She was not crying. She was not asking if I was alive or if I was hurt or if my house was destroyed. "Kelsey, this behavior is absolutely unacceptable." Patricia's voice was ice cold, dripping with venom. "We have worked entirely too hard to build our reputation in this city for you to destroy it with a pathetic pity party on television. We had important guests at that dinner. You are acting like a spoiled, ungrateful child. I expect you to call the station immediately and issue a retraction. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Do not force your father to get involved because you know how angry he gets." I deleted the voicemails. I did not shed a single tear. The sadness that had weighed me down since David died had suddenly hardened into something sharp, cold, and incredibly clear. They did not care that I had almost died. They did not care that I was grieving. They only cared that their pristine, wealthy facade was cracking for the world to see. I opened my phone settings and navigated to my contact list. I found Brittany's number. I clicked block. I found Patricia's number. I clicked block. I found Richard's number. I clicked block. Then I dialed a completely different number. The phone rang twice before a deep professional voice answered on the other end. "Hello, Kelsey. How can I help you at this hour?" the voice asked. It was Thomas, the senior partner at the private wealth management firm David and I used. "Thomas," I said, my voice perfectly steady in the quiet hospital room. "I need you to prepare the paperwork. It is time to trigger David's real will. And I want to initiate a full financial audit on the holding companies connected to my brother-in-law. The game is over." The harsh morning light filtering through the hospital blinds did nothing to warm the sterile room. I was sitting up in bed, the lingering headache from the carbon monoxide poisoning throbbing behind my temples, when the heavy wooden door was thrown open with aggressive force. I did not even have time to reach for my call button before my mother Patricia marched into the room. She was clutching a bouquet of cheap plastic-wrapped carnations that she must have grabbed from the hospital gift shop downstairs. Right behind her was my older sister Brittany, holding her smartphone high in the air with the recording light blinking red. My father Richard brought up the rear, his face flushed red with anger, as he immediately closed the door and stood against it like a prison guard. There was no rush to my bedside. There were no tears of relief seeing that I was alive. There was not a single question about my health or the fact that I had nearly died in a frozen, flooded basement just 12 hours ago. Instead, Patricia threw the cheap carnations onto the foot of my hospital bed and pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. "You are going to fix this right now," Patricia hissed, her voice vibrating with a terrifying rage. "You have always been a selfish, dramatic child, but going to the local news to publicly humiliate us is a new low even for you." Brittany shoved the phone closer to my face. The bright recording light felt blinding. "Do you have any idea what you have done to my reputation?" Brittany shrieked. "My phone has not stopped ringing since the 10 o'clock broadcast. The country club board election is next week. I had to spend my entire morning answering messages from other wives asking if we actually abandoned you to go eat oysters. You made us look like monsters." I stared at them in absolute silence. My lungs still burned with every breath I took, and my body was covered in bruises from tumbling down those wooden stairs. Yet all my sister cared about was her standing in a suburban country club. I realized then that my family had not come to the hospital to check on my recovery. They had come to do damage control. Patricia reached into her expensive leather handbag and pulled out a single sheet of paper. She slammed it down on my lap tray. "This is a press release," Patricia commanded. "You are going to look right into Brittany's camera and read every single word on that page. You will say that you were confused from your grief. You will say that we offered to pick you up, but you insisted on taking a rideshare. You will say the water damage in your house was a complete surprise, and we had absolutely no way of knowing the pipes were frozen. Read it." I looked down at the paper. It was typed out perfectly, likely drafted by my father's corporate public relations team in the middle of the night. It was a complete fabrication designed to completely absolve them of their neglect. I remembered being 12 years old when I fell off a horse at my uncle's farm and broke my collarbone. Patricia had refused to take me to the emergency room for 4 hours because she did not want to leave a prestigious charity luncheon early. When we finally went to the hospital, she forced me to tell the doctors I had tripped on the stairs at home so she would not be judged for her negligence. She expected me to do the exact same thing right now. She expected me to swallow my trauma to protect her aesthetic. I picked up the piece of paper. I looked directly into the lens of Brittany's phone. Then I looked at my sister's face, noting the panicked sweat forming on her forehead. "You can stop recording," I said, my voice eerily calm and steady. "I am not reading a single word of your pathetic cover-up. And Brittany, you really should put the camera down. Your expensive foundation is melting off your face, and you are starting to look exactly as ugly on the outside as you are on the inside." I gripped the top of the paper and ripped it straight down the middle. The sound of the tearing paper echoed loudly in the tense room. I tore it again, reducing their meticulously crafted press release to confetti, and threw the pieces right at Brittany's chest. Richard pushed himself off the door, his large frame marching toward my bed with an intimidating swagger. He had always used his physical size and booming voice to end arguments, and he clearly thought I would cower the moment he raised his voice. "You listen to me, you ungrateful brat!" Richard barked, slamming his fist down on my tray table so hard my water cup tipped over. "You think you hold all the cards because you played the victim on television, but you are forgetting who handles the money in this family. I am the sole managing broker on David's life insurance policy." He leaned in close, his face mere inches from mine, his breath smelling of stale coffee and pure malice. "That policy is worth $1.5 million. You think you are going to use that money to fix your ruined house. You think you are going to use it to live comfortably while you disrespect us. I will tie that policy up in legal red tape for a year. I will demand investigations. I will hold those funds in escrow until you are completely bankrupt. You do not have the resources to fight my firm. Your little crisis management job is nothing but glorified secretarial work. You answer phones for angry rich people. You do not have the power to challenge me. You will sign a retraction today, or you will starve." I did not flinch. I did not pull away from his aggressive posture. I simply reached up with my uninjured hand and casually pulled the intravenous line monitor slightly to the side so I had a clear view of his furious face. "You are going to freeze David's life insurance payout?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. That is a fascinating strategy, Richard. Truly. But I think you should probably check your work emails before you make threats you cannot execute. Richard frowned, standing up slightly straighter. What are you talking about? I smiled. It was a cold, sharp smile that made Patricia take a sudden step backward. You always underestimated my job, Dad. You thought crisis management meant answering phones. You never realized I advise venture capital firms on how to liquidate hostile assets. And because you underestimated me, you also underestimated David. Last year, David noticed some very strange administrative fees being pulled from his portfolio. He did a quiet audit. He discovered you were skimming commissions from his accounts to fund your golf trips. Richard's face drained of all color. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. David fired your brokerage firm 11 months ago. I continued, my voice slicing through the silence like a scalpel. He moved his life insurance and all of our investments into an independent trust managed by a private wealth group in New York. You have absolutely zero access to my money. The $1.5 million cleared into my private account at 8 o'clock this morning. Oh, and by the way, before I left Tokyo, I forwarded David's audit logs to the Federal Financial Regulatory Board. I imagine the auditors are walking into your downtown office right about now. Right on cue, the cell phone inside Richard's suit jacket began to ring violently. He pulled it out with shaking hands. The caller ID displayed his office manager's name. Richard stared at the screen, a bead of sweat tracing down his pale cheek, completely paralyzed by the realization that his entire career was about to be dismantled. Before Richard could answer the phone, the hospital room door opened again. Colin, my brother-in-law, stepped inside. Colin was a sharp-dressed investment banker who always played the role of the rational peacemaker, though his intentions were always purely self-serving. He quickly assessed the panic on Richard's face and the torn paper on my bed. Let us all just calm down, Colin said, using his smooth, heavily practiced negotiation voice. He walked past Patricia and stood beside Brittany, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. Kelsey, emotions are running high. You just lost your husband. We all understand you are lashing out because of your grief. But destroying your family over a miscommunication is not what David would have wanted. We need to be reasonable. Colin reached into his pristine leather briefcase and pulled out a thick cream-colored document folder. He opened it and placed a single sheet of paper on my tray table right over the torn pieces of the press release. I did not want to bring this up so soon, Colin said, adjusting his expensive silk tie. But since we are discussing finances, we need to address David's outstanding debts. Right before he left for his overseas trip, David borrowed $300,000 from Brittany's interior design firm. He said he wanted to surprise you with a massive home renovation when he returned. Here is the promissory note he signed. Since you have just received his life insurance payout, we expect that debt to be settled by the end of the week. If you refuse, my lawyers will place a lien on your property and freeze your personal bank accounts by Monday morning. Patricia immediately stepped forward, sensing a new opportunity to exert control. She crossed her arms and looked down her nose at me. You owe your sister this money, Patricia demanded. Brittany's business has been struggling this quarter because of the economy. You are sitting on a massive payout that you do not even need. Be a good sister for once in your life and pay your debts. I sacrificed my entire college fund so Brittany could have her dream wedding, and you need to learn how to sacrifice for your family too. I looked at the document sitting on my tray table. It looked incredibly official. It had the logo of Brittany's design firm at the top. It detailed a loan of $300,000 for contracting work on a property we did not even own. And at the bottom there was a signature that looked remarkably like David's handwriting. I reached out and picked up the paper. I held it up to the light coming from the hospital window, examining the ink strokes and the dates printed in the margins. The room was dead silent, waiting for my reaction. Colin stood with a smug, victorious grin on his face, clearly believing he had successfully trapped me in a legal corner. You guys really went all out for this one, I said, keeping my eyes fixed on the document. The signature is a very good forgery, Brittany. You almost captured the way he loops his letter D. But there is a massive problem with your timeline. I slowly lowered the paper and looked directly into Colin's eyes. My gaze was steady and unforgiving. This promissory note is dated October 14th. I stated clearly, tapping my finger on the printed date at the bottom of the page. You claim David signed this in your office on October 14th to secure funding for a renovation. Yes, Colin replied, his smug smile faltering just a fraction. He came to my office right before lunch. That is truly fascinating, I replied, because on October 12th, David suffered his brain aneurysm in Singapore. By the morning of October 14th, David was on life support in an intensive care unit in Tokyo, surrounded by a team of neurologists. He was in a deep, unresponsive coma. So unless my husband somehow learned to astral project his physical body across the Pacific Ocean to sign a fraudulent loan document in your office, you just handed me physical proof of a felony. Colin's face contorted in sheer panic. Brittany gasped, taking a sudden step away from her husband as if trying to distance herself from the crime. Let me be very clear about what you just did. I continued, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy tone. You brought a forged financial instrument across state lines. You attempted to extort $300,000 from a grieving widow using a falsified signature of a deceased man. Wire fraud, forgery, and extortion carry mandatory minimum sentences of 5 to 10 years in federal prison. I do not even need to hire a lawyer for this. I can just hand this piece of paper directly to the police officer stationed in the hospital lobby. Colin lunged forward to snatch the paper off my tray table. I was faster. I slid the document under my blanket and pressed my thumb directly onto the red emergency call button attached to my bed rail. Take one more step toward me, Colin, and I will scream assault, I warned him. And the nurses outside already know you are hostile. Colin froze. His chest heaved with panicked breaths. He looked at Brittany, who was staring at the door in absolute terror, realizing her entire wealthy suburban lifestyle was one phone call away from being completely obliterated. Patricia could no longer contain her fury. Her entire face turned a blotchy, uneven purple. She marched right up to the side of my bed, practically vibrating with uncontrollable rage. She raised her hand as if she wanted to strike me, but stopped just short when the call button speaker crackled to life with a nurse asking if I needed assistance. I replied that I was fine for the moment, keeping my eyes locked on my mother. You are dead to us, Patricia screamed, abandoning any pretense of maternal affection. You hear me. You are completely dead to this family. I am formally disowning you right here and right now. You are forbidden from attending any family holidays. You are banned from our home. You are nothing to me. You are a cold, calculating, miserable woman who destroys everything she touches. She leaned down, her voice dropping into a vicious sneer. You used to follow me around like a lost puppy begging for my approval. You used to cry in your room when we took Brittany on vacations without you. You need us. You have always needed us. When the money runs out and you are sitting alone in that rotting, flooded house, do not you dare pick up the phone to call me. I will let you rot. Patricia spun around on her expensive heels. We are leaving, she commanded. Let her drown in her own misery. Richard was still staring at his ringing phone, completely paralyzed by the impending destruction of his career. Colin grabbed Richard by the arm and forcibly pulled him toward the door. Brittany rushed out into the hallway without looking back, terrified that the police might already be waiting for her. Patricia paused in the doorway. She looked back at me one last time, expecting to see the terrified, desperate little girl who always apologized just to keep the peace. She expected to see tears. She expected to see regret. I just smiled and gave her a small, dismissive wave. Patricia slammed the heavy hospital door so hard the framed medical posters on the wall rattled. The room plunged back into total silence. I waited for exactly 10 seconds to ensure they were truly gone. I took a deep breath, letting the adrenaline slowly leave my system. I did not feel sad. I did not feel abandoned. For the first time in my 33 years of life, I felt completely and utterly free. I reached over to my bedside table and pulled my secure work laptop out of my dry bag. I opened the screen and typed in my encrypted password. The portal to my venture capital firm loaded instantly, displaying a vast network of financial databases and corporate registries. My family thought they could starve me out. They thought they could use debt to control me. They had spent my entire life underestimating my intelligence and my resources. I cracked my knuckles, ignoring the dull ache in my bruised shoulder. I opened a new search query tied directly to the federal corporate tracking system. "All right, Colin," I whispered to the empty room. "Let us see exactly how much stolen money you are hiding in your perfect, pristine portfolio. And let us see how much of my father's retirement you have already gambled away." As a senior partner at Aegis Capital, one of the most ruthless venture capital firms on the West Coast, I had clearance levels that most financial regulators only dreamed of. My family had always assumed my job title, crisis management consultant, meant I answered phones for angry executives. They had no idea I was the executive who liquidated their companies when they failed. I bypassed the standard public registries and tapped directly into the Federal Banking Clearinghouse. I pulled up Colin's pristine investment portfolio. On the surface, it looked like the typical holdings of a successful wealth manager. But as I traced the routing numbers through a web of offshore shell companies, the illusion evaporated. Colin was not a financial genius. He was running a glorified Ponzi scheme. He had been taking new client investments and secretly funneling them to cover massive catastrophic losses he had suffered in high-risk offshore trading. My eyes scanned the ledger, searching for one specific account number: Richard's primary retirement fund. The fund my father had spent 30 years building. The fund he constantly bragged about at the country club. I found the routing history. 4 months ago, Colin had initiated a quiet, unauthorized transfer. He had completely drained my father's $4 million nest egg to cover a desperate margin call. My father was legally bankrupt, entirely dependent on a son-in-law who was drowning in illegal debt, and neither of them had realized the house of cards was about to collapse. I switched tabs and pulled up the commercial mortgage records for Brittany's supposedly elite interior design firm. The results made me let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. She was 6 months behind on her lease. The bank had already initiated preliminary foreclosure proceedings. The $300,000 promissory note they had tried to extort from me was not for a home renovation. It was a desperate criminal attempt to save Brittany from public bankruptcy. 2 hours later, Nina the nurse walked into the room with my discharge papers. Her eyes widened when she saw the complex financial algorithms reflecting in my glasses. "You look like you are plotting a war," she said, handing me a fresh set of clothes that the hospital social worker had kindly provided. I closed the laptop and offered her a genuine smile. "Not a war, Nina, just an eviction notice." An hour later, a sleek black town car dispatched by my firm was waiting for me outside the hospital. The driver, a discreet man named Marcus, opened the door for me. "We are not going back to the suburban house," I told him as I slid into the leather seat. "Take me to the corporate penthouse downtown." The Aegis Capital penthouse was a sprawling, high-tech fortress of glass and steel overlooking the Seattle skyline. It was a property my firm kept strictly for visiting billionaires and senior partners. My family did not even know it existed. I walked across the heated marble floors, the panoramic view of the city, offering a stark contrast to the freezing, flooded basement where I had nearly died. I ordered hot food, took a long shower to wash the smell of the hospital off my skin, and settled onto the massive velvet sofa. I opened my phone and accessed a burner social media account I used for corporate surveillance. My family was already spinning their web of lies. Brittany had launched a GoFundMe campaign titled "Support for Our Grieving Family." The description was a masterpiece of manipulation. She claimed I was suffering from severe psychological distress, that I had locked them out of my house, and that they desperately needed funds to cover the costs of David's memorial service because I had selfishly hoarded his life insurance. She had even posted a tearful video dabbing at her dry eyes, begging her wealthy friends to donate. While Brittany was begging on the internet, Colin was trying to play hardball in the financial sector. My private banking concierge sent me an urgent alert. Colin had attempted to use his banking credentials to freeze my personal credit cards, flagging them as stolen, in a pathetic attempt to cut off my resources and force me to come crawling back to them. What Colin did not know was that my accounts were protected by the Federal Reserve's highest security tier. His unauthorized access attempt triggered an automatic fraud alert. He had just handed the federal government documented proof of his cybercrimes. As I scrolled through Brittany's social media feed, a new post caught my eye. It was a digital invitation adorned with gold foil graphics, in loving memory of David, a celebration of life, hosted by Richard and Patricia at the Oak Ridge Country Club. I stared at the screen, my blood running cold. They were hosting a memorial service for my husband, a husband they had mocked, a man whose funeral they had refused to attend because flights were too expensive. They were using his tragic death as a networking event to collect sympathy donations and secure new business investors to save their failing companies. The invitation explicitly noted that security would be present to ensure the event remained a private, safe space for the family, a clear implication that the unstable widow was banned from attending. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct line to my chief investment officer at Aegis Capital. He answered on the first ring. "Kelsey," he said, his voice filled with concern. "We saw the local news. The entire board is ready to deploy whatever resources you need. Tell us what to do." I stood up, walking toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the city lights. "I need you to authorize an immediate hostile debt acquisition," I commanded. "Contact the commercial lender holding the mortgage for Brittany's interior design firm. Buy the debt in full. Then reach out to the offshore creditors holding Collins' margin calls. Buy those too. Transfer all the primary creditor rights directly to my personal holding company. I want to own every single asset they possess before sunrise." "Consider it done," he replied without hesitation. "Anything else?" "Yes," I said, a cold, calculating calm settling over me. "Send my best tailored suit to the penthouse. I have a memorial service to attend tomorrow afternoon, and I plan to give the eulogy." The morning sun pierced through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Aegis Capital penthouse, casting long shadows across the pristine marble floor. My tailored black suit was waiting for me on a velvet hanger exactly as I requested. I slipped it on the sharp lines and structured shoulders, feeling like a suit of armor. I checked my encrypted tablet one last time. My chief investment officer had worked a miracle overnight. The offshore debt holding Collins' margin accounts and the commercial mortgage for Brittany's failing design firm had been fully acquired by my private holding company. I was now their sole creditor. They owed me everything, and they had absolutely no idea. Marcus drove me to the Oak Ridge Country Club in silence. The parking lot was overflowing with luxury vehicles. My family had turned my husband's memorial into a high society networking event, weaponizing his death to solicit investments and sympathy. I walked up the manicured stone steps to the main entrance. Two large security guards stood in front of a velvet rope. A gold-plated sign read, "Private Memorial for David, invitation only." As I approached, one of the guards held up his heavy hand. "Sorry, ma'am, we have strict orders from the hosts. You are not on the approved guest list." I did not even have time to reply before the heavy oak doors swung open. Patricia marched out into the lobby, her face twisting into a mask of pure hatred when she saw me standing there. "I told you that you were dead to us," Patricia hissed, her voice vibrating with suppressed rage so the nearby valet would not hear. "You have some nerve showing your face here after what you did to us on the local news. This event is for people who actually cared about David. Turn around and walk away before I have you arrested for trespassing." Patricia raised her hand, fully intending to slap me right across the face in front of the club staff. My reflexes were faster. I caught her wrist mid-air, my grip tight and unyielding. Patricia gasped in shock, trying to violently pull her arm away. I stepped closer, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "Do not ever try to strike me again," I said coldly. "And as for trespassing, you might want to check with the club manager. Your credit cards were declined an hour ago. Every single one of them. The venue was about to cancel the entire memorial and kick your wealthy friends out into the freezing parking lot. I paid the $40,000 invoice in cash 10 minutes ago. I own this room today." I dropped her wrist. Patricia stood frozen, her jaw hanging open as the security guards quickly stepped aside to let me pass. I pushed through the heavy oak doors and walked into the grand ballroom. The room was packed with Seattle's elite. Politicians, real estate developers, and country club board members sat at round tables drinking expensive champagne. At the front of the room, Brittany was standing at a podium adorned with white lilies. She was wiping a fake tear from her cheek, delivering a sickeningly sweet speech about how much David had meant to her before seamlessly transitioning into a pitch for her interior design firm's new charitable foundation. I walked straight down the center aisle. The sharp click of my heels echoed over the quiet murmur of the crowd. People turned in their seats, their eyes widening as they recognized me from the news broadcast. Brittany froze mid-sentence. Her hands gripped the edges of the podium so hard her knuckles turned white. "What are you doing here?" Brittany whispered harshly as I stepped up onto the stage. "Get off this stage right now." I did not answer her. I simply reached out and took the microphone directly from her trembling hands. I turned to face the sea of wealthy guests. The silence in the room was absolute and suffocating. "Good afternoon," I said, my voice echoing through the massive ballroom. "My name is Kelsey. I am David's widow. I know you were not expecting me today, seeing as my family hired security to keep me out of my own husband's memorial. But I felt it was important to be here to celebrate the truth." I pulled my phone from my jacket pocket. "Last night I told the crowd my brother-in-law Colin tried to extort $300,000 from me using a forged promissory note. He claimed David wanted to fund Brittany's interior design business. What Colin did not realize was that his offshore trading accounts were bleeding millions, and he left a very clear digital trail on his unencrypted business line." I connected my phone to the ballroom's Bluetooth audio system. I tapped the screen, playing an audio file my security team had intercepted from Colin's cloud storage. The audio echoed through the speakers, loud and perfectly clear. Brittany's recorded voice filled the room. "David dying is perfect timing. The bank is threatening foreclosure on the storefront. Just squeeze the life insurance money out of Kelsey. She is weak. She will sign anything if we threaten to cut her out of the family." Then Colin's voice replied on the recording. "I am already drafting the fake loan documents. We will drain her dry by Friday." I disconnected the phone. The crowd erupted into horrified gasps. Wealthy socialites covered their mouths in pure shock. Investors who had given Colin their money stood up from their tables, their faces pale with sudden realization. Brittany burst into tears, covering her face with her hands and backing away from the podium. From the back of the room, a roar of fury shattered the murmurs. My father, Richard, charged down the center aisle. His face was a dark, dangerous shade of purple. The veins in his neck were bulging. He was completely out of his mind with rage, realizing his entire social standing had just evaporated in 60 seconds. "I will kill you," Richard screamed, lunging up the stage steps with his fists raised. "You ungrateful, vindictive little witch." I did not move an inch. I stood perfectly still, watching my father prepare to strike me down in front of 200 people. But before his foot even hit the top step, the heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom slammed open with a deafening crash. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," a voice boomed over a bullhorn. "Nobody move." A dozen armed federal agents and financial crimes officers flooded into the ballroom. They did not even look at me. They swarmed the stage, bypassing Richard entirely, and tackled Colin to the polished hardwood floor. The sound of metal handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed over the screams of the guests. Colin Hayes, an agent, shouted, hauling my brother-in-law to his feet. "You are under arrest for massive securities fraud, money laundering, and the embezzlement of over $4 million in client pension funds." Patricia pushed her way through the panicked crowd. She threw herself at the federal agents, weeping hysterically as they dragged Colin toward the exit. Then, in a moment of pure, blinding desperation, Patricia turned and ran to the edge of the stage. She fell to her knees, grabbing the hem of my trousers. "Kelsey, please!" Patricia wailed, her makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. "You have the insurance money. You have to hire him a defense team. He will go to federal prison. Brittany will lose everything. You have to save your family." I looked down at the woman who had abandoned me at the airport, who had left me to freeze in a flooded basement, and who had formally disowned me just 24 hours ago. I gently but firmly pulled my trouser leg out of her desperate grip. "You are asking the wrong person for help, Patricia," I said coldly. "We are busy. Try an Uber." The line clicked dead. I lowered the phone, letting the absolute silence of the penthouse wash over me. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass, the city lights of Seattle sprawled out like a glowing circuit board, oblivious to the total destruction I was preparing to unleash. But before I stepped into that country club tomorrow, before I stood in front of their wealthy friends and business partners, I needed more than just a surface-level understanding of their ruin. I needed the granular, undeniable proof that would leave my family with absolutely nowhere to hide. I opened my encrypted work laptop again. The preliminary sweep had shown me the missing funds and the pending foreclosures, but the Aegis Capital forensics software was capable of far more. I activated the Deep Dive Protocol, a proprietary algorithm our firm used to trace dark money across international borders and unregulated banking sectors. If Colin thought his clever little shell companies and spoofed IP addresses were untraceable, he was about to learn a very harsh lesson in modern financial warfare. I started by tearing apart Brittany's facade. Her elite interior design firm was nothing but a hollow, rotting shell. I pulled up her accounts payable and vendor invoices, watching the digital ledger paint a pathetic picture of desperation. She had not paid a legitimate supplier in over 14 months. The luxury imported Italian marble, the custom silk draperies she flaunted on her social media, the bespoke furniture she claimed to design it, was all financed through predatory short-term loans. She was utilizing lenders that carried 30% interest rates and aggressive collection tactics. Brittany and Colin were parading around the Oak Ridge Country Club acting like local royalty while secretly drowning in a sea of toxic debt. Their entire upper-class lifestyle was a masterclass in staging entirely funded by stolen money and desperate credit extensions. But Brittany's failed business was just a symptom. The real disease was Colin. I shifted the search parameters directly to his personal wealth management firm. I bypassed the sanitized, legally compliant quarterly reports he sent to his clients and used my clearance to access the raw, unedited transaction ledgers passing through the federal clearinghouses. The software immediately flagged a massive series of anomalous wire transfers. These were not investments in offshore real estate or high-yield hedge funds, as he likely claimed to his trusting clients. They were direct deposits to holding accounts tied to major international casinos and unregulated online gambling syndicates. The truth hit me with a sickening clarity. Colin was not a victim of a fluctuating market, he was a degenerate gambler. I watched the numbers scroll down the screen, each line a testament to his hubris. $50,000 wired to a casino in Macau. $100,000 transferred to a sports betting syndicate in the Cayman Islands. $250,000 flushed down the drain in a single catastrophic weekend in Monaco. He had been chasing his losses for years, doubling down with money that did not belong to him. As his losses mounted, his desperation had clearly escalated. When the legitimate credit lines dried up, Colin had turned to the shadows. The algorithm highlighted several massive incoming deposits from untraceable offshore LLCs. These entities were well known to federal authorities as fronts for black market lending. Colin had borrowed millions from loan sharks to feed his addiction and maintain his perfect suburban facade. These were not creditors who sent polite past due notices in the mail. These were people who destroyed lives to collect their debts. And when those dangerous people came collecting, Colin had done the only thing a coward could do. He started stealing from the people who trusted him the most. I set the software to cross-reference Colin's active client list with the embezzled funds. I needed to see exactly who he had sacrificed to save his own skin. The progress bar hummed as it matched stolen deposits to victim accounts, bypassing the fake monthly statements Colin had been generating to hide his tracks. When the final forensic report populated on my screen, I had to physically brace my hands against the cool glass of the coffee table. I had suspected he was skimming, but the sheer staggering scale of the theft took my breath away. And the name at the very top of the victim list, the single largest account he had completely liquidated to pay off his illicit gambling debts, made a cold smile spread across my face. It was Richard, my father. The man who had spent my entire life belittling my career while boasting about his own financial dominance. Richard had trusted Colin with his entire life savings and expansive retirement portfolio built over 4 decades of ruthless corporate climbing. My father loved to brag about his wealth, using his checkbook as a leash to control everyone around him. He funded Brittany's delusions of grandeur with it. He commanded Patricia's absolute loyalty with it. He had tried to starve me out and force me into submission with it just hours ago in my hospital room. Now that wealth was entirely gone. Every blue-chip stock, every municipal bond, every liquid asset Richard possessed had been quietly drained by his golden boy son-in-law and handed over to offshore loan sharks. Richard was legally destitute. He was entirely dependent on a man who was moments away from a federal indictment. They had tried to break me today. They had thrown me away, assuming their combined power and wealth would crush me into a desperate apology. They thought I would come crawling back to them, begging for scraps. They had no idea they were already standing in ashes. I highlighted the damning ledgers, the casino transfers, the black market loan agreements, and the complete liquidation of Richard's retirement fund. I sent the entire packet to the secure printer in the penthouse office. The heavy machine hummed to life, churning out page after page of undeniable catastrophic truth. I walked into the office and gathered the warm pages, neatly arranging them into a thick leather-bound dossier. Tomorrow afternoon, my family wanted to put on a show. They wanted to use my husband's memory as a prop for their vanity and greed. I ran my hand over the smooth leather cover of the dossier. I was going to give them a performance they would never forget. I closed the leather-bound dossier, the heavy thud of the cover feeling like a gavel coming down on my father's legacy. Just as I reached for my coffee, my phone screen illuminated the darkened office. A priority alert flashed from the social media monitoring software my firm used to track market sentiment. It had flagged a sudden spike in engagement around my family's name. I opened the notification and found myself staring at Brittany's face. She had just gone live on a major crowdfunding platform, cross-posting a video to all her social media channels. She looked entirely different from her usual polished self. Her hair was strategically messy, her makeup completely absent to highlight the dark circles under her eyes. She was sitting in the corner of her lavish living room, clutching a crumpled tissue. "I never thought I would have to make a video like this," Brittany said to the camera, her voice trembling with perfectly rehearsed fragility. "We are living a nightmare. Not only did we just lose my wonderful brother-in-law, David, but his widow, my sister Kelsey, has suffered a severe psychological break." I leaned closer to the screen, my expression hardening as the lies poured from her mouth. "She has completely lost her grip on reality," Brittany continued, wiping away a fake tear. "She has seized all of David's assets, locked our grieving family out of his estate, and yesterday she physically threatened my parents. We are terrified. She has cut off the funds we desperately need to give David the memorial he deserves, and she is trying to destroy my interior design business out of pure spite. I am starting this campaign to protect our family, save my life's work, and ensure David gets a proper farewell. Anything helps." I scrolled down. The campaign goal was set at $500,000. In less than an hour, it had already raised $12,000 from their wealthy, gullible country club circle. The audacity was breathtaking. She was weaponizing my husband's death and my supposed mental instability to fund a desperate cash grab. I opened my encrypted network and bypassed the public registry to dig into the exact status of her interior design showroom. The reality was even more pathetic than her video. The business was not just failing, it was legally dead. Her commercial landlord had filed a final eviction notice 48 hours ago. Her rent was 6 months past due. The high-end furniture populating her showroom was completely financed through aggressive lenders, and the repo orders were already stamped by a local judge. She needed that $500,000 to stop the bank from chaining the doors of her showroom on Monday morning. I picked up my secure phone and dialed my chief investment officer. "Execute the final phase," I told him, my voice colder than the Seattle rain beating against the penthouse windows. "Buy out the entire portfolio of bad debt attached to Brittany's interior design firm. I want the commercial lease, the vendor liens, and the inventory loans. Then package it with the offshore casino debts Colin owes. Transfer the complete creditor rights to my private holding company immediately. Do whatever it takes to secure the paper before noon." "Consider it done," he replied, the typing on his end frantic and precise. You will be their sole legal creditor within the hour. You own them, Kelsey. I disconnected the call and stood up. I walked into the master bedroom where the black Alexander McQueen suit hung waiting. It was time to get ready. The afternoon sky was a bruised, heavy gray as my town car pulled up to the wrought iron gates of the Oak Ridge Country Club. The parking lot was overflowing with luxury vehicles. My family had truly turned David's memorial into a high society spectacle. I stepped out of the car, the sharp wind whipping against my tailored suit. I carried the thick leather dossier under my arm. I walked up the manicured stone steps to the main entrance. A gold-embossed sign sat on an easel near the double doors. Private memorial for David Hayes. Invitation only. Standing directly in front of the doors were two large, imposing private security guards. Patricia had clearly anticipated my arrival and hired muscle to keep me out. I stepped forward and the larger guard held up a thick hand. "Sorry, ma'am," he said gruffly. "We have strict orders from the hosts. If your name is not on the VIP list, you do not get inside." I did not flinch. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, opening an email from the country club's general manager. "I think you will find that the hosts no longer have any authority here," I said evenly, holding the screen up for him to read. Colin's accounts had been frozen by federal regulators the moment he tripped my security firewalls last night, which meant the platinum credit card Patricia had placed on file to cover the $40,000 catering and venue invoice had violently bounced just an hour ago. The club manager had been in a complete panic preparing to shut down the event and throw everyone out into the parking lot. I had contacted the club directly and paid the invoice in full, transferring the venue rental into my name. The guard read the email, his eyes widening as he saw the manager's explicit instructions granting me absolute control over the ballroom. He swallowed hard immediately, stepping aside and pulling open the heavy oak door. "My apologies, Miss Hayes," he murmured, keeping his eyes on the floor. "Right this way." I stepped into the grand lobby. The muffled sound of polite applause echoed from the main ballroom. I pushed through the secondary doors and stepped into the back of the room. It was packed with Seattle's elite. Politicians, real estate developers, and socialites sat at round tables decorated with expensive white lilies. At the front of the room, standing behind a polished wooden podium, was Brittany. She was wearing a designer black dress, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, delivering a sickly sweet speech about David's humble nature. She was just pivoting her speech seamlessly, transitioning from mourning my husband into a pitch for her newly launched charitable foundation, urging the wealthy guests to donate. In the corner, Collins stood sweating through his suit, constantly checking his phone, completely unaware that federal agents were likely already building his indictment. Near the front table, Richard was holding court with a group of potential investors, boasting about his massive retirement portfolio, blissfully ignorant that his accounts held absolutely nothing. I adjusted my grip on the leather dossier and began walking straight down the center aisle. The sharp, rhythmic click of my heels cut through the soft murmur of the crowd. Heads began to turn. Whispers rippled through the tables as people recognized me from Brittany's unhinged morning video. Brittany looked up from her notes. The color instantly drained from her face. Her hands gripped the edges of the podium so hard her knuckles turned a stark, bruised white. Patricia stood up from her seat in the front row, her mouth dropping open in sheer horror. I did not stop until I reached the stage. I climbed the short flight of stairs and walked directly up to my sister. The entire ballroom held its collective breath. "What are you doing here?" Brittany hissed through gritted teeth, leaning in close so the microphone would not catch her voice. "Get out before I have security drag you out." I looked at her, my expression perfectly blank. I reached out, clamped my hand over the microphone, and gently pushed her aside. I turned to face the 200 wealthy, influential guests staring back at me. I opened the leather dossier and laid it flat on the podium. "Good afternoon," I said, my voice echoing through the silent, cavernous room. "My name is Kelsey. I am David's widow, and I am here to correct the record." I set the heavy leather dossier onto the polished wooden podium. Before anyone in the stunned crowd could react to my introduction, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my encrypted phone. I had drafted an email hours ago attaching a 500-page digital file containing every offshore transfer, every loan shark contract, and every forged accounting ledger Colin had ever generated. I tapped the send button. The files instantly transmitted anonymously to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Regional Financial Crimes Division. The game begins, I whispered to myself, sliding the phone away. Brittany lunged forward from the side of the stage. Her carefully practiced mask of fragile grief completely dissolved, replaced by wild, unhinged panic. She reached out, her manicured hands clawing at the microphone stand. "Turn that off right now," Brittany hissed, her voice catching on the amplifier and blasting over the ballroom speakers. "Someone call club security. She is trespassing and having a psychotic break." I did not yield an inch. I stepped directly into her space, bracing my shoulder against hers and forcing her to stumble backward. "Security works for the venue owner, Brittany," I said into the microphone, my voice ringing clear and authoritative. "And since Colin's Platinum credit card declined the $40,000 catering invoice this morning, I paid the bill in cash. I own this room today. Now sit down and be quiet." A collective gasp rippled through the sea of wealthy socialites and corporate investors. Patricia leapt from her front row seat, her face flushed an ugly shade of purple with fury. My father quickly grabbed her arm and pulled her back down, his eyes darting nervously toward his powerful business partners seated at the adjacent tables. He hated public scenes more than anything. "You are all here today under the impression that you are mourning my husband," I continued, sweeping my gaze across the silent audience. "But the hosts of this lavish event did not even attend his actual funeral. They refused to visit him in the hospital. They mocked his background, and they did not contribute a single dollar to his medical care. They are hosting this absentee memorial for one reason only. They desperately need your money." I opened the leather dossier. "Let us start with the grieving sister-in-law," I announced, pulling out the first stack of printed documents. "Brittany has been using this tragedy to solicit donations for a supposed charitable foundation." I held up the bank records for the crowd to see. "Do not write her a check. Her elite interior design firm is a complete mirage. She is exactly 6 months behind on her commercial lease. Her inventory is financed by predatory lenders at 30% interest, and her bank initiated formal asset seizure protocols 48 hours ago. Your sympathy donations are not going to charity. They are going to stop her landlord from padlocking her showroom doors on Monday morning." Brittany let out a choked, humiliating sob. She covered her face with her hands and backed away toward the edge of the stage. Whispers erupted from the tables. I watched several affluent women who had just written checks hastily reach into their designer purses to tear them up. "But a failing furniture business is just collateral damage," I said, raising my voice to cut through the rising murmur. I turned my attention to Colin. He was standing near the emergency exit doors, looking like a cornered rat frantically dialing his phone. "The real danger is the man managing your wealth." I pulled the next stack of papers from the dossier. "Colin Hayes has built his entire reputation on being an untouchable financial genius. Many of you in this room trust him with your corporate accounts and your family retirement funds. You believe your money is safely growing in protected offshore accounts. It is not. Colin is a degenerate gambler who owes millions to black market syndicates." Colin froze. He dropped his phone on the hardwood floor with a sharp clatter. His face drained of all color, leaving him looking sickly and pale. "Lies," Patricia screamed from the front row, completely losing her composure. She pointed a shaking finger at the stage. "She is a sick, vindictive liar. Do not listen to a word she says." I held up the printed ledgers, my grip steady. "I have the wire transfers, Patricia. I have the routing numbers sending client funds directly to casinos in Macau and unregulated sports betting syndicates in the Cayman Islands. Colin has been running a massive Ponzi scheme to cover his bad bets, and the well has finally run dry." I shifted my gaze directly to my father. Richard had spent his entire life building his fortune. He used his wealth as a weapon to control our family, to make me feel small, and to dictate my worth. Just yesterday he had tried to starve me out and force me into submission. Now he was staring at me with a mixture of profound confusion and dawning terror. "If you do not believe me," I said softly, letting my voice carry a lethal, unforgiving edge. Ask Richard. Ask him to log into his retirement portfolio right now. Because 4 months ago, Colin quietly liquidated his entire $4 million nest egg to cover a catastrophic margin call. Your money is gone, Dad. Every single penny of it. The silence that hit the ballroom was absolute and suffocating. It was the sound of a decades-old dynasty evaporating into thin air. Richard turned his head slowly, his neck moving stiffly to look at Colin by the door. Colin could not meet his eyes. The golden boy son-in-law took a stumbling step backward, confirming everything without saying a single word. My father collapsed back into his chair, clutching his chest, the reality of his total financial ruin crashing down on him. I closed the leather dossier. The beautiful part of bad debt is that it can be bought for pennies on the dollar, I told the silent room. You thought I was a helpless widow. You thought I was funding my life with David's insurance money. You did not know that I am a senior venture capitalist at Aegis Capital. And last night I authorized a hostile acquisition. I looked down at Brittany, then across the room at Colin, and finally at my parents. I bought the commercial lease for the design firm. I bought the vendor liens. I bought the offshore casino debts. My private holding company is now your sole legal creditor. You owe me everything. The silence in the ballroom stretched until it snapped. Patricia let out a visceral shriek, entirely unable to comprehend the public destruction of her carefully curated reality. She scrambled up the stage steps, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered hatred. She lunged at me, her arm raised high, fully intending to slap me across the face in front of 200 of Seattle's most influential people. "What the hell are you doing here?" Patricia screamed, her voice shrill and echoing over the sound system. "Get out of my event right now." My reflexes were faster. I caught her wrist mid-swing, my grip tight and unyielding. Patricia gasped in shock, her eyes widening as she struggled to pull her arm back. I held her firmly in place, leaning in so only she could feel the absolute ice in my gaze. "I came to hear exactly how much money you plan to make off my husband's death," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal register. I shoved her hand away, forcing her to stumble backward into the lavish arrangement of white lilies. Patricia caught her balance and pointed a shaking finger at me. "Security!" she shrieked, turning toward the 2 large guards standing by the emergency exit. "Arrest her. She is trespassing. Remove her from my venue immediately." The guards took a hesitant step forward, but before they could reach the stage, the heavy mahogany double doors at the back of the ballroom swung open with a resounding crash. A team of 6 people walked in, moving in perfect synchronization. They were not security guards. They were the senior partners and lead litigators from Aegis Capital's legal division. Dressed in immaculate charcoal suits and carrying thick leather briefcases, they projected an aura of absolute financial dominance. The country club guards instantly stepped back, recognizing that this was an entirely different class of power. Vance, my lead counsel, walked straight down the center aisle, bypassing the stunned socialites and politicians. He climbed the stage steps and handed me a thick stack of finalized injunctions and asset seizure warrants. "Thank you, Vance," I said smoothly. I turned back to the crowd and looked directly at the country club general manager, who was sweating profusely near the front table. "Where is the club manager?" I asked into the microphone. He reluctantly raised his hand. "Please tell my mother exactly who owns this room today." The manager swallowed hard, looking at Patricia with deep discomfort. "Mrs. Hayes, your platinum card declined this morning. We ran it 3 times. We ran Mr. Hayes' corporate card and Colin's private accounts. Everything came back frozen with federal error codes. We were about to cancel the event." Patricia stared at him, her mouth hanging open. "I paid the $40,000 invoice in cash 10 minutes ago," I announced to the room. "This family does not have a single credit card that will clear a cup of coffee right now. Every asset they possess is frozen, seized, or legally transferred to my holding company." The murmurs in the crowd erupted into outright gasps. Wealthy investors who had been chatting amiably with Colin moments ago were now frantically backing away from his table, their faces pale with the sudden realization that their own money might be compromised. Brittany was hyperventilating behind the podium, her hands clutching her designer dress. "You are insane," she sobbed, looking frantically at the guests. She is having a psychotic break. Please, someone call the police. I just launched a GoFundMe to save our family. I pulled a tablet from Vance's briefcase and connected it to the ballroom's massive projection screen. Brittany's GoFundMe campaign flashed above us in high definition. The donation counter sat at $12,000. My sister is currently asking you for charity, I told the crowd. She claims she needs money to honor David. But if you look closely at the screen, you will see what my tech division just accomplished. I tapped a single button on the tablet. The GoFundMe page refreshed. A bright red banner appeared across the top of the campaign. This campaign has been suspended for suspected wire fraud and grand larceny. All funds are being refunded to the donors. Brittany let out a choked wail, dropping to her knees on the stage. Her interior design firm is a fraud. I continued, my voice echoing relentlessly. She is 6 months behind on her lease. Her inventory is financed by predatory lenders at 30% interest. She needed your donations to stop the bank from chaining her showroom doors shut on Monday morning. Colin bolted for the side exit door, his survival instincts finally overriding his shock. He threw his weight against the push bar, but the door did not budge. 2 men in plain clothes stepped out from the shadows of the hallway and shoved Colin back into the ballroom. Federal badges hung around their necks. And then there is Colin, I said, pointing directly at my brother-in-law. The financial genius. The man who promised you double-digit returns. He has been taking your investments and wiring them directly to unregulated sports betting syndicates in the Cayman Islands. My father Richard stood up, his face a terrifying shade of gray. He looked at me, then at Colin, his chest heaving as the reality of his ruin finally settled in. Dad, I said, making eye contact with him for the first time, I checked your retirement portfolio an hour ago. Colin liquidated your entire $4 million nest egg to cover his offshore casino debts. You are legally destitute. Richard collapsed back into his chair as if he had been shot. The arrogant patriarch, who had spent decades treating me like a disposable asset, was now a broken, bankrupt old man. He grabbed his chest, his breathing shallow while his business partners watched him fall apart. Patricia looked around the room, realizing that their high society friends were no longer looking at them with respect. They were looking at them with absolute disgust. The perfectly curated facade of the Hayes family had been obliterated in less than 10 minutes. Kelsey. Please, Patricia whispered, her voice cracking, as she stepped toward me, her hands raised in a desperate, pleading gesture. We are family. You cannot do this to us. You have the money now. You can fix this. I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel worthless. I thought about how she had abandoned me at the airport when I was 15 just to enjoy a luxury vacation. I thought about how she had tried to extort me over my husband's grave. We stopped being family a long time ago, Patricia, I said with quiet, devastating finality. I stepped back from the podium and nodded to the federal agents standing by the door. The agents moved in, pulling Colin's arms behind his back and snapping heavy steel handcuffs shut. The sharp metallic click echoed across the silent ballroom, signaling the absolute end of their reign. I handed the microphone to Vance, adjusted my tailored jacket, and walked off the stage, leaving them to burn in the ashes they had created. The Oak Ridge Country Club was a fortress of pristine wealth nestled behind towering wrought iron gates and acres of manicured emerald greens. By 2 o'clock the following afternoon, the private valet circle was completely choked with luxury sedans and imported sports cars. My family had spared absolutely no expense for what Patricia had tactfully branded an absentee memorial. There was no casket, no somber reflection, and certainly no genuine mourning. It was a grotesque high-society networking event, masquerading as a funeral designed specifically to monetize my husband's death. Through the tinted windows of my black town car parked discreetly near the edge of the lot, I watched Seattle's corporate elite funnel into the grand ballroom. The hypocrisy of it all tasted like ash in my mouth. They had rented the club's most expensive hall, adorning it with thousands of imported white orchids and cascading silk draperies. A massive, overly retouched portrait of David stood at the center of the stage, flanked by discreetly placed donation boxes for a memorial fund that I knew for a fact did not legally exist. Inside that ballroom, I knew exactly what kind of performance was taking place. Patricia would be holding court near the front entrance wearing a perfectly tailored black designer dress and a tragic expression. She would be soaking up the sympathetic embraces and whispered condolences from the wives of local politicians, squeezing out tears on cue while her manicured hands eagerly accepted thick envelopes filled with cash. She was treating my widowhood as her own personal spotlight, thriving on the attention and the unchecked influx of unrecorded sympathy money. But the real predators were working the floor. I could easily picture Colin, his charm dialed up to a frantic, desperate maximum. He would be cornering the wealthiest tech executives and real estate developers near the open bar, leveraging the emotional vulnerability of the room to pitch his exclusive offshore wealth management funds. He needed fresh capital urgently. The loan sharks were circling, and Colin was using his dead brother-in-law's memorial as a hunting ground to find his next unsuspecting victims, hoping to funnel their investments directly into his black market debts. Brittany would be right beside him, capitalizing on the wealthy crowd. She would be weeping delicately into a tissue one moment and handing out glossy, embossed business cards for her interior design showroom the next. She would be weaving tales of how design was helping her cope with the grief, subtly pressuring the country club wives into booking lucrative home renovation consultations. Every handshake, every tear, every shared memory of David was just a transactional pivot to save her legally dead, bankrupt business from total collapse. They had meticulously locked me out of the entire spectacle. Standing at the main double doors of the ballroom were two massive, broad-shouldered private security guards. They wore earpieces and carried a strict, laminated guest list on a clipboard. Patricia had explicitly instructed them to deny me entry. I was the grieving widow, yet I was banned from the very building where my husband's life was being commemorated. They wanted to control the narrative entirely, ensuring I could not disrupt their lucrative show or expose the hollow reality behind their wealth. I sat back against the cool leather seats of the town car, watching the rain begin to streak the tinted glass. I did not feel angry anymore. The fiery, chaotic rage from the hospital room had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, absolute, and surgical precision. They thought placing two hired muscles at a door would protect their fragile empire. They still operated under the delusion that power was physical, that it belonged to whoever threw the loudest tantrum or hosted the most expensive party. I opened my encrypted work laptop, resting it on my knees. The screen glowed in the dim light of the car. The leather-bound dossier sitting on the seat beside me was only the physical prop for the final confrontation. The true weapon was purely digital. I pulled up the secure, untraceable email server I had configured earlier that morning. Attached to the draft was a massive encrypted file spanning over 500 pages. It contained every damning piece of evidence the deep dive algorithm had pulled from the dark web and federal clearinghouses. It held the unredacted ledgers showing Colin skimming millions from his clients, the exact routing numbers proving the money was funneled to offshore casinos, and the black market loan contracts he had signed with known criminal syndicates. It included the proof of Richard's completely liquidated retirement fund and the financial forensics showing Brittany's business was a hollow shell sustained by predatory lending and fake vendor invoices. I typed in the recipient addresses. The first went directly to the regional director of the Securities and Exchange Commission. The second was routed to the lead investigator of the Seattle Police Department's Financial Crimes Division. The third went to the federal banking regulators overseeing Colin's firm. I looked up through the rain-slicked window at the glowing chandeliers of the country club. Inside, my family was raising glasses of expensive champagne, congratulating themselves on their brilliance, convinced they had broken me. They were toasting to their survival, completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet had already vanished. I rested my finger over the trackpad. I took one slow, steady breath, letting the cool air of the car fill my lungs, and pressed send. The progress bar flashed green, confirming the massive data packet had been successfully transmitted to the authorities. The game begins. The moment my shoes hit the carpeted floor of the main aisle, the grand oak double doors at the back of the ballroom were thrown violently open. A rush of cold, damp air swept through the lavish room, carrying with it the piercing glare of red and blue police lights flashing in the country club courtyard. A dozen federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with FBI and Financial Crimes Task Force emblazoned across their backs flooded into the elegant space. They moved with a rigid tactical efficiency, their heavy boots disrupting the quiet sanctity of Seattle's most exclusive venue. A collective sigh of relief rippled through the sea of wealthy guests. The tension in the room instantly shifted. I could see the smug satisfaction returning to the faces of the socialites sitting at the front tables. They genuinely believed the authorities were here for me. They assumed the club manager or one of Patricia's influential friends had finally called the police to remove the hysterical trespassing widow who was ruining their catered afternoon. Brittany scrambled up from the floor of the stage, her tear-streaked face twisting into a vindictive sneer. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at my chest. "Thank God," Brittany cried out, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Arrest her! She hijacked our private memorial. She is completely unhinged and she is trespassing on private property. Take her away." The lead FBI agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man, holding a thick stack of warrants, walked directly down the center aisle toward me. The crowd parted for him, fully expecting him to read me my rights. I did not break my stride. I kept my head high, walking calmly toward the exit. As we crossed paths, the lead agent did not even glance in my direction. He walked right past me, his eyes locked dead ahead. He marched straight toward the side exit where the two plainclothes officers were holding Colin against the wall. The smug murmurs of the elite crowd died instantly, replaced by a sudden, terrifying confusion. "Colin Hayes," the lead agent's voice boomed over the dead silence of the ballroom. "You are under federal arrest. We are charging you with multiple counts of first-degree securities fraud, gross embezzlement of private retirement funds, and international money laundering." The words struck the room like physical blows. The investors who had just been drinking Colin's expensive champagne and listening to his offshore pitches began to panic. Men in tailored suits frantically pulled out their cell phones, desperately trying to call their private wealth managers and legal teams. The realization that their own money might be tied up in Colin's illegal gambling rings sent a shockwave of sheer terror through the country club. Colin's knees buckled. The arrogant, untouchable financial genius completely vanished. He was sobbing, begging the agents to let him call his lawyer as they tightened the steel cuffs around his wrists and dragged him roughly toward the main doors. "Wait!" Brittany shrieked, running down the stage steps and trying to chase after her husband. "You cannot take him. This is a mistake." Two female agents intercepted her before she could reach the aisle. They did not offer her sympathy. They handed her a thick manila folder. Brittany Hayes, one of the agents, said sharply, "This is a federal subpoena for your interior design firm. Your business accounts have been frozen pending a full forensic audit regarding your involvement in your husband's money laundering operations. Do not attempt to leave the state." Brittany dropped the folder. The papers scattered across the floor, mixing with the pristine white orchid petals that had fallen from the floral arrangements. She fell to her knees, screaming Colin's name as the agents marched him out into the freezing rain. I stood near the exit, watching the absolute destruction of their carefully curated empire. My father Richard was still sitting at his VIP table, entirely catatonic. He was staring blankly at the wall, his hands trembling violently in his lap. The man who had spent his entire life bullying people with his massive bank accounts was now completely empty. The elite friends he had spent decades trying to impress were actively turning their backs on him, grabbing their coats and rushing for the exits to distance themselves from the radioactive Hayes family name. Then I heard the frantic clicking sound of heels rushing toward me. Patricia shoved her way through the panicking crowd. Her perfect designer dress was wrinkled, her immaculate hair ruined. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated desperation. Her entire reality had just been shattered, and like always, she turned to her favorite scapegoat to fix it. She threw herself at me, her hands grabbing desperately at the lapels of my black suit. She was sobbing hysterically, completely ignoring the fact that federal agents were securing the room around us. "Kelsey," Patricia wailed, her fingers digging into my fabric. Kelsey, you have to stop this. You have to save him. I looked down at her, my expression utterly detached. Save who, Patricia? Colin, she screamed, her voice cracking with absolute panic. You have David's life insurance money. You have the private accounts. You have to use that money to pay Colin's bail and hire him the best defense team in the city. If he goes to federal prison, how is your sister supposed to live? Brittany will lose everything. You have to save her. The sheer blinding audacity of her demand was staggering. Even now, standing in the wreckage of a memorial they had hosted just to steal money, Patricia was demanding that I sacrifice my husband's legacy to protect the golden child. She truly believed my only purpose in life was to serve them. I looked at the woman who had spent 30 years making me feel completely invisible. I reached up, my movements slow and deliberate. I grabbed Patricia's wrists and forcefully pried her fingers off my suit. I shoved her hands back toward her chest. You are asking the wrong person, I said. I turned my back on my mother, pushed through the heavy oak doors, and walked out into the cold Seattle rain, leaving them trapped in the nightmare they had built for themselves. The freezing rain struck my face, threatening to wash away the adrenaline pumping through my veins, but my exit was immediately interrupted. Before I could reach the door of my waiting town car, Vance stepped out from the shadows of the club's grand entrance, shielding us both with a massive black umbrella. He informed me that while Colin was already secured in the back of a federal transport vehicle, the rest of the Hayes family was staging a hysterical sit-in. They were refusing to leave the premises, screaming at the country club management and demanding to speak with me. They were cornered animals, and cornered animals were unpredictable. I decided right then to deliver the final crushing blow. I instructed Vance to have the club's private security forcibly escort my parents and my sister into the executive VIP suite off the main lobby. I wanted total privacy for the execution. The VIP suite was a fortress of soundproof mahogany, smelling faintly of aged bourbon and expensive cigar smoke. I walked in a few moments later, shrugging off my damp jacket. Patricia, Richard, and Brittany were huddled around a heavy oak conference table. They looked pathetic. Patricia's mascara was smeared down her cheeks, and Brittany was hyperventilating, aggressively clutching her dead cell phone as if it might magically ring with a solution. Richard was pacing the length of the Persian rug, his chest heaving with indignant rage. The moment the heavy door clicked shut, severing us from the chaos outside, Richard lunged forward. He slammed his fists onto the table, his face a mask of purple fury. He demanded to know how I dared to humiliate the family name. He completely ignored the fact that his son-in-law was a federal criminal. He bellowed that I had destroyed their social standing, ruined their financial networks, and orchestrated a malicious public spectacle. He ordered me to fix the mess, to use whatever insurance payout David had left me, to hire a crisis management team, and clean up the public relations disaster I had caused. I let him scream. I let his fragile, narcissistic ego empty itself into the silent room. When he finally ran out of breath, panting and red-faced, I calmly unlocked my briefcase. I pulled out a single, thick, legally bound dossier and dropped it onto the center of the glass table with a heavy, satisfying thud. I looked at the three of them, my gaze sweeping over their desperate faces. "You are operating under a massive delusion," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet room. "You spent the entire afternoon fighting over scraps, assuming this was all about a standard life insurance policy. You spent years treating David like a disposable corporate drone." I watched their expressions falter as I peeled back the curtain on my husband's true life. I revealed that David was not just an employee. He was the lead architect and a silent partner in an underground tech incubator. For the last 5 years, he had been working nights and weekends writing code for a revolutionary proprietary data encryption algorithm. The patent was registered solely and entirely in his name. Upon his death, that intellectual property transferred completely to me. I paused, letting the silence stretch, ensuring every single syllable would hit its target. A major Silicon Valley conglomerate finalized the acquisition of David's patent just 72 hours ago, I told them. The ink is dry, the funds have cleared, the software was officially valued and sold for $50 million. The sound of that number physically struck the room. The air vanished. Patricia gasped. her hands flying to her throat as her knees buckled, forcing her to sink into a leather chair. Brittany completely stopped crying. Her tears dried instantly, replaced by a sudden feral gleam of absolute greed. The reality of her husband being hauled off to federal prison was instantly eclipsed by the sheer magnitude of the wealth sitting across the table. Richard froze, his eyes bulging as his mind desperately tried to comprehend a sum of money that dwarfed his entire lifetime of business achievements. I did not give them a single second to process the revelation. I reached into my briefcase again and placed 2 crisp documents next to the dossier. I laid out my final terms. "I have 2 options for you," I stated coldly. "Choice 1 is the document on the left. It is an ironclad binding, non-disclosure and severability agreement. You will completely relinquish any right to interfere in my life. You will never contact me. You will never come near me, and you will never attempt to lay claim to a single cent of this estate. If you sign this and vanish, I will pay the legal fees to hire the best white-collar defense attorneys in Seattle to reduce Colin's sentence. I will ensure Brittany does not spend the rest of her life completely bankrupt." I tapped the second document. "Choice 2 is you refuse. I walk out that door. I leave Colin to rot under the maximum federal sentence. I leave Brittany to face the SEC auditors completely alone. And I leave you, Richard and Patricia, to drown in the millions of dollars of offshore debt Colin just anchored to your names." Patricia lunged for the table, sobbing hysterically, begging Richard to sign it. Brittany reached for the pen, her hands shaking with desperate urgency, knowing this was her absolute only lifeline. But Richard intercepted them. His pride, his toxic, arrogant ego simply could not handle the reality of the situation. The idea of $50 million sitting directly in front of him, controlled by the daughter he had spent a lifetime treating like garbage, completely shattered his mind. He snatched the agreement off the glass table. His face twisted into a snarl of supreme, unearned authority. He ripped the heavy legal paper in half, then tore it into quarters, throwing the shredded pieces directly onto the floor. "You have $50 million!" Richard roared, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. "I am your father. Under the law, I have the absolute right to sue you. I will drag this estate into probate court and demand my rightful share. I do not need your charity, and I will not be blackmailed by my own blood." I looked at the shredded paper on the floor. I looked at the sheer, blinding arrogance radiating from his eyes. And then I tilted my head back and laughed. It was a loud, genuine, and terrifying sound that echoed off the mahogany walls. The laughter wiped the fury right off Richard's face, replacing it with sudden, creeping dread. I stopped laughing and looked him dead in the eye, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "I have been waiting for you to say that all afternoon," I said. "See you in court." 3 weeks later, the air inside the conference room of Seattle's most ruthless litigation firm was practically vibrating with toxic arrogance. Richard had somehow managed to scrape together the absolute last dregs of his liquid assets, leveraging every remaining favor he had in the city to hire a notorious corporate attorney named Sterling to drag me into a brutal, high-stakes deposition. They walked into the sterile, glass-walled room, looking like a family that had already won the lottery. Brittany sat across the long mahogany table, sipping imported sparkling water with an insufferable, gloating smirk. She had completely abandoned the grieving sister-in-law routine, dressed sharply in a vibrant red blazer, acting as if Colin's federal indictment was nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. Patricia had meticulously reapplied her mask of wealthy victimhood, wearing diamonds that I knew for a fact were heavily insured against the massive debts threatening to swallow them whole. Richard was practically glowing with vindictive triumph. He paced behind his leather chair, whispering aggressively into Sterling's ear, casting lethal glares in my direction. They genuinely believed that by throwing an expensive lawyer at me, they could terrify me into submission. They thought the mere threat of a prolonged legal battle would force me to hand over the $50 million software patent just to make them go away. The court reporter sat at the head of the table, her fingers poised over her stenotype machine, ready to capture every word. Sterling leaned forward, adjusting his heavy gold cufflinks, and launched into a theatrical, booming monologue. He spoke down to me, using a tone reserved for petulant children. He declared that his clients were asserting their rightful familial claim over David's intellectual property. He threatened to freeze the entire $50 million payout in probate court for the next decade, ensuring I would never see a single dime unless I surrendered 60% of the total sum immediately. He cited marital asset loopholes and a daughter's moral and legal obligation to support her grieving parents. Brittany smiled across the table, her eyes gleaming with absolute malice. She slid a piece of paper across the polished glass, tapping it with a manicured fingernail. It was the same handwritten promissory note she had ambushed me with weeks ago. The document claiming David owed her failing interior design firm $300,000 for imaginary consulting fees. Sterling proudly announced that this note proved David had deeply entwined his finances with the Hayes family, establishing a legal precedent for them to seize the estate's larger assets. I did not flinch. I did not argue. I simply sat back in my chair, folded my hands in my lap, and looked at Vance. My lead counsel had been sitting beside me, with the relaxed, bored posture of a man watching a slow-motion car crash. Vance unlatched his heavy leather briefcase. He did not raise his voice. He did not object to Sterling's arrogant grandstanding. He just started dealing documents onto the table like a casino dealer handing out losing cards. The first folder landed directly in front of Richard with a sharp smack. Vance announced clearly for the court reporter that the folder contained the finalized federal indictment for Colin, along with the complete unredacted list of the family's frozen assets. He placed a second, significantly thicker folder directly in front of Brittany. Vance stated that this was the absolute financial autopsy of her interior design firm. It detailed massive negative equity, multiple outstanding lawsuits from unpaid contractors, and an impending Chapter 7 bankruptcy filing that she had desperately tried to keep hidden from the public. Brittany's arrogant smirk vanished instantly. Her face drained of color as she stared at the undeniable proof of her financial ruin. Patricia let out a sharp gasp, reaching blindly for the papers, her hands shaking violently. But Vance was just getting started. He reached across the table and picked up Brittany's $300,000 promissory note with two fingers, holding it up to the fluorescent light, as if examining a piece of trash. He calmly informed the room that our digital forensics team had run a microscopic metadata extraction on the document. He pointed to the date on the note, which claimed it was signed by David 6 months ago. Then Vance pulled a manufacturer's invoice from his briefcase. He explained that the specific watermarked heavy stock paper Brittany had used to forge the note was only manufactured and shipped to her office exactly 2 days after David's death. Furthermore, Vance added, his voice dropping to a lethal quiet register, the digital signature overlay perfectly matched a saved PDF file the FBI had just extracted from Colin's seized hard drive. Vance leaned across the glass table, staring directly into Brittany's wide, terrified eyes. He stated for the official record that submitting a fabricated financial document to extort funds from an estate during a legal deposition was not just a civil dispute, it was felony wire fraud and grand extortion. He calmly informed the room that the same federal agents who had dragged her husband out of the country club were currently sitting in a black SUV outside this very building, waiting for a single phone call from our office to add her name to the criminal indictment. The air in the room completely evaporated. The suffocating silence was broken only by the rapid clicking of the court reporter's machine. Sterling stared at the forged document in Vance's hand. The high-priced legal shark looked at the bankruptcy filings, then looked at Richard's sweating, panicked face. The realization hit the attorney like a freight train. He understood instantly that his clients had not only lied to him about their financial standing, but they had also dragged him into the epicenter of an active, highly radioactive federal criminal conspiracy. His law license and his own freedom were suddenly on the line. Sterling stood up so fast, his heavy leather chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. He did not bother organizing his meticulously prepared notes. He simply started shoving documents and legal pads haphazardly into his briefcase, his hands visibly shaking with a mixture of rage and terror. Richard jumped up, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He demanded to know what his lawyer was doing, ordering him to sit back down and fight the allegations. He yelled that he was paying the firm top dollar to crush me. Sterling snapped his briefcase shut, the loud metallic click echoing like a gunshot. He glared at my father with pure, unfiltered disgust. He announced to the room, ensuring the court reporter caught every single word that he was formally withdrawing as their legal counsel effective immediately. He stated that he refused to represent clients actively engaging in felony extortion during a sworn deposition. Sterling turned toward the door, but paused, looking back at Richard to deliver the final devastating blow. "I am withdrawing from this case," Sterling said, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "And Mr. Hayes, the accounting department just notified me regarding the platinum credit card you used to pay my firm's $100,000 retainer this morning. It just declined due to insufficient funds and a total federal freeze on your accounts. You are entirely out of money, and you are entirely out of luck." Sterling did not look back. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind him, sealing the remaining members of the Hayes family inside the soundproof room. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Richard stared at the closed door, his chest heaving, as his brain struggled to process the sheer velocity of his lawyer's departure. The arrogant certainty that had defined his entire existence was fracturing, but his toxic pride refused to let him accept defeat. He turned his furious gaze back to me, his face twisting into a mask of desperate, aggressive denial. "That is a bluff!" Richard roared, slamming his fist onto the glass table so hard the water glasses rattled. "You manipulated a bank freeze to scare my attorney. You think you can terrify me, Kelsey. You think you can starve me out. I have a $4 million private retirement trust sitting in an offshore account that your pathetic federal friends cannot even see, let alone touch. I am calling my wealth manager right now. I will have a team of corporate sharks in this room within the hour to tear you to pieces." He reached into his tailored suit jacket with shaking hands and yanked out his phone. He aggressively tapped the screen, holding the device to his ear with a triumphant, menacing glare. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at Vance and nodded. "You can put the phone down, Dad," I said, my voice ringing with a cold, devastating clarity. "You are dialing a dead number." Richard froze, the phone still pressed to his ear. Vance reached into his briefcase one last time. He pulled out a slender red-tabbed folder and slid it across the smooth glass surface. It stopped exactly inches from Richard's clenched fist. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table, closing the distance between us. "There is no $4 million trust," I stated, enunciating every single word. "There is no safety net. You spent the last decade bragging about your untouchable wealth, but you were too arrogant to actually monitor it. You gave Colin comprehensive, unrestricted power of attorney over your entire portfolio 3 years ago because you thought it made you look like a financial dynasty." Richard stared at the red folder, his breathing growing shallow. He slowly lowered the phone from his ear. "Colin did not just start laundering money yesterday." I continued, my gaze locked onto his terrified eyes. "When the offshore syndicates first came to collect his massive gambling debts 8 months ago, he needed immediate, untraceable liquid cash. He could not drain his clients' accounts fast enough without triggering an audit. So he looked for the easiest, most arrogant target he could find. He looked at you." Richard scrambled to open the folder. His trembling fingers tore at the cardboard cover. He flipped open the first page. It was a certified, time-stamped bank statement from his exclusive wealth management firm. "Read it," I commanded. "Colin liquidated your entire $4 million nest egg exactly 8 months and 12 days ago," I explained, watching his eyes dart frantically across the pages. "He executed 3 separate wire transfers to a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands under the guise of an aggressive real estate investment. He drained every single cent you had saved for the last 40 years. Your balance is exactly 0. You are completely destitute." Richard let out a strangled, breathless gasp. His eyes bulged as he flipped wildly through the subsequent pages, desperate to find a mistake, a hidden balance, anything to prove me wrong. But every page confirmed the exact same reality: complete and total financial annihilation. "But it gets worse," I added, refusing to give him a second to breathe. "Turn to the last page." Richard's hands were shaking so violently he could barely turn the paper. "Remember those tax optimization documents Colin had you sign last winter?" I asked. "The ones you bragged about at the country club. You did not optimize your taxes, Dad. You signed a commercial release. Colin used those signatures to take out a massive predatory second mortgage on the family estate. He stripped 100% of the equity out of your house to cover his remaining margins. Patricia let out a horrifying, guttural shriek. She lunged forward, grabbing the papers from Richard's hands. The house is in default, I stated clearly. The grace period expired yesterday. The bank is moving to foreclose on the mansion by Friday morning. You do not have a retirement. You do not have a home. You do not have a single penny to your name. The reality of the absolute ruin finally struck Richard's heart. His face drained of all color, shifting from crimson to a terrifying, sickly gray. The phone dropped from his hand, clattering loudly against the glass table. He grabbed the center of his chest, his mouth opening and closing as he gasped desperately for air. His eyes rolled back slightly and his legs completely gave out. He collapsed heavily backward into his leather chair, clutching his heart, wheezing in the grip of a mild cardiac event. Patricia did not even look at her husband. She was staring at the zero balances printed on the bank statements. The realization that her life of luxury country club lunches and designer wardrobes was permanently over snapped her mind completely in half. She turned her head slowly, her eyes locking onto Brittany, the golden child, the favorite daughter, the wife of the man who had just destroyed their entire lives. Patricia let out a scream of pure feral rage. She lunged across the corner of the table and grabbed Brittany by the lapels of her red blazer. Before Brittany could even react, Patricia swung her hand back and slapped her daughter across the face with devastating, echoing force. "What have you done?" Patricia shrieked, spit flying from her lips. "What have you and that criminal husband of yours done to us? You stole my house! You stole my life!" Brittany cried out in pain, holding her stinging cheek. She shoved her mother backward, her own aristocratic facade completely shattering. "I did not know," Brittany screamed back, tears of panic streaming down her face. "He lied to me too." "Do not touch me, you parasite!" Patricia roared, lunging forward to grab a handful of Brittany's hair. "You brought that thief into this family, you ruined us." The two women crashed against the mahogany walls, screaming, scratching, and tearing at each other's clothes like wild animals. The pristine, elegant country club VIP suite had transformed into a cage match. Richard remained slumped in his chair, clutching his chest, completely unable to stop the violent implosion of his family. The unified front that had spent decades bullying, belittling, and tormenting me had finally turned its vicious teeth on itself. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my jacket. I looked at the wreckage unfolding in front of me. There was no pity in my chest. There was no sadness. There was only the cold, satisfying silence of absolute justice. I looked at Vance, who was calmly snapping his briefcase shut. "We are done here," I told him. I turned my back on the screaming, the crying, and the ruin. I walked out of the suite, the sound of their mutual destruction fading behind me as I stepped out into the clean, open air. I had barely taken 10 steps across the wet cobblestones of the courtyard when the heavy mahogany doors of the country club violently burst open behind me. The cold air was a welcome relief from the suffocating toxicity of the VIP suite, but the peace was instantly shattered. The sharp, frantic clicking of high heels echoed rapidly through the freezing rain, accompanied by ragged, desperate breathing. Brittany was sprinting. The golden child, the untouchable favorite who had just spent the last hour grinning at me from across a conference table, was running through a torrential downpour. Her designer red blazer was soaked, clinging awkwardly to her frame. Her immaculate, expensive blowout was ruined, plastered in dark, wet streaks against the sides of her face. She looked like a madwoman. "Kelsey, wait!" she shrieked, her voice cracking as she closed the distance between us. "Please, you have to wait." She did not just stop in front of me. She practically dove onto the pavement, her knees slamming harshly into the cold, wet stone. The impact tore the fabric of her tailored trousers, but she did not even seem to notice. She reached out and wrapped her arms around my legs, clutching my damp coat with a terrifying, feral desperation. The sheer indignity of the display was staggering. The few valet attendants standing under the grand awning froze in shock, watching a prominent member of Seattle's high society groveling in the puddles like a common beggar. "You have to help us," Brittany wailed, tilting her head back to look at me. Her mascara was running in thick black rivers down her cheeks. "Please, Kelsey, I am begging you. You have $50 million. That is enough to make all of this go away. You can pay off the SEC. You can save my design firm. You can save Mom and Dad's house. You can fix Colin's mistakes. We are family. We are sisters. You cannot just leave us out here to die. Please, I will do anything you want. I will apologize for everything. Just write the check. I looked down at the pathetic weeping woman clinging to my ankles. For 30 years, she had stepped on my neck. She had mocked my clothes, belittled my career, and stood by laughing while our parents treated me like a disposable servant. Now stripped of her husband's fraudulent wealth and her parents' protective arrogance, she was nothing. I did not feel a single shred of pity. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. I reached down firmly, grabbed her wrists, and forcefully peeled her trembling fingers off my coat. I took a deliberate step backward, forcing her to support her own weight in the dirt. "Save your firm," I asked, my voice slicing cleanly through the sound of the falling rain. "Save Mom and Dad's mansion. You still do not understand how deep this goes, Brittany. You think Colin was just a bad gambler. You think you are just victims of unfortunate circumstance. You think money is a magic wand that can just rewind time and erase your profound stupidity." I watched her eyes dart back and forth, desperate and uncomprehending, searching my face for a lifeline that did not exist. "Let me explain the reality of your situation." I continued, speaking slowly so she could absorb every single syllable. 6 months ago, when your interior design firm first defaulted on its commercial leases, your creditors panicked. They realized you were a financial liability. When Colin took out that massive predatory second mortgage on the family estate to cover his offshore syndicate losses, the bank immediately flagged it as toxic, unrecoverable debt. The financial institutions wanted to offload those liabilities as fast as humanly possible before your entire house of cards collapsed and left them holding the bag. Brittany swallowed hard, her jaw trembling violently in the cold. "So they sold that debt," I said, maintaining absolute eye contact. "Someone swooped in and bought all of it for pennies on the dollar. A private equity firm bought the commercial lease to your storefront. They bought the overdue invoices from your contractors. And they bought the exclusive holding rights to the second mortgage on Richard and Patricia's sprawling estate. Do you remember the name of the firm that holds your absolute financial ruin in their hands, Brittany?" She stopped crying. Her breath hitched in her throat as a new profound terror began to wash over her features. She knew the name. She had been dodging their aggressive, certified letters for weeks. "Aegis Brittany," whispered her voice, barely audible over the rain. "Aegis Capital." "Yes, Aegis Capital," I replied, a slow, icy smile spreading across my face. "It is a very aggressive, very quiet holding company. I established it 18 months ago using the initial seed funding from David's tech incubator. I am the sole founder, the majority shareholder, and the chief executive officer of Aegis Capital." Brittany completely stopped breathing. She remained paralyzed on her knees, the freezing rain soaking her to the bone. Her mind visibly shattered as she realized that the faceless, ruthless corporate entity she had been terrified of, the shadowy firm she had been hiding from, was actually me. I had not just been ignoring them for the past year. I had been systematically, legally buying the very ground beneath their feet. I owned her debt. I owned her failures. I owned her entirely. I held out my hand without looking away from her pale, horrified face. Vance stepped up silently beside me, completely unaffected by the weather, and placed 3 thick laminated legal documents into my palm. They were protected in clear plastic sleeves, pristine and ready for execution. I tossed the heavy packets onto the wet cobblestones, letting them land directly in front of Brittany's bleeding knees. "Those are 3 court-ordered asset seizure and foreclosure mandates," I stated, my voice echoing across the courtyard with total unyielding finality. "They were signed by a federal bankruptcy judge at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. Aegis Capital is officially calling in the debts. As of this exact second, your interior design boutique, your frozen corporate bank accounts, and the sprawling mansion our parents are currently sitting in legally belong to me." Brittany let out a suffocated, broken wheeze. She reached out with a trembling hand, staring at the bold blue ink of the judge's signature visible through the plastic sleeve. The reality of her absolute destruction was no longer a threat. It was a legally binding fact. You have exactly 24 hours to gather whatever pathetic personal belongings you can carry and get off my property, I said, turning my back on her and pulling open the door of my waiting town car. If any of you are still inside my house by tomorrow afternoon, I will have you arrested for trespassing. The icy downpour soaked through my suit jacket instantly, the freezing rain a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the ballroom. I had only taken a few steps across the wet cobblestones of the country club courtyard when the heavy oak doors burst open behind me. Patricia, Richard, and Brittany stumbled out into the storm. They were completely unhinged. Brittany was screaming my name, her voice shrill and jagged over the sound of the police siren still blaring near the service exit. Richard grabbed my shoulder, his fingers digging painfully into my collarbone as he forcefully spun me around. He was red-faced, demanding I go back inside, ordering me to fix the public relations disaster unfolding in front of his elite friends. They were causing a massive, humiliating spectacle right in the middle of the valet lane. Federal agents were actively cordoning off the area, and club members were pressing their faces against the glass windows to watch the Hayes family completely unravel. I stared at Richard's hand on my shoulder, then looked up at his desperate, furious eyes. I was not going to let them drag me into a screaming match in the mud. "Get your hands off me," I said, my voice dangerously low. "If you want to finish this, we do it out of the public eye. Get into the private VIP suite. Now." I turned and marched back through the secondary entrance, leading them away from the flashing police lights and into the secluded soundproof mahogany VIP room adjacent to the main lobby. The moment the heavy door clicked shut, severing us from the chaos outside, the silence in the room was absolute. The air smelled faintly of aged bourbon and expensive leather. It was the perfect sterile environment for an execution. Brittany collapsed into one of the oversized leather armchairs, sobbing violently into her hands. Patricia paced the length of the Persian rug, wringing her hands, her immaculate facade completely destroyed. Richard stood near the fireplace, his chest heaving with indignation. "You are going to transfer David's life insurance policy into our primary accounts by tomorrow morning," Richard ordered, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You are going to hire Colin, the best defense attorneys in the state. You will not let this family name be dragged through federal court. You owe us this." I walked over to the long glass conference table in the center of the room. I set my wet briefcase down, the heavy thud cutting through Patricia's frantic pacing. I popped the brass locks, letting the metallic clicks echo in the quiet space. "You are all operating under a massive, pathetic delusion," I stated calmly, looking at each of them. "You spent the entire afternoon fighting over scraps, assuming this was all about some standard corporate life insurance policy. You spent the last decade treating David like a disposable employee, mocking his modest salary and belittling his career. You never actually knew what my husband was building." The absolute certainty in my voice made Richard pause. Brittany slowly lowered her hands, her tear-streaked face looking up at me in sudden, confused silence. "David was not just an IT manager," I explained, pulling a thick, legally bound dossier from my briefcase and dropping it onto the glass table. "For the last 5 years, he was the lead architect and a silent partner in an underground tech incubator. He worked nights and weekends writing code for a revolutionary proprietary data encryption algorithm. The patent was registered solely and entirely in his name. Upon his death, that intellectual property transferred completely to me." I paused, letting the silence stretch, ensuring every single syllable would hit its target. "A major Silicon Valley conglomerate finalized the acquisition of David's patent just 72 hours ago," I told them, my gaze locked on Richard. "The ink is dry. The funds have cleared. The software was officially valued and sold for $50 million. The sound of that number physically struck the room. The air vanished. Patricia gasped, her hands flying to her throat as her knees buckled, forcing her to sink into the nearest chair. Brittany completely stopped breathing. Her tears dried instantly, replaced by a sudden feral gleam of absolute unfiltered greed. The reality of her husband being hauled off to a federal penitentiary was instantly eclipsed by the sheer magnitude of the wealth sitting across the table. Richard froze. His eyes bulged as his mind desperately tried to comprehend a sum of money that dwarfed his entire lifetime of business achievements. The daughter he had deemed worthless was suddenly holding a fortune he could not even fathom. I did not give them a single second to process the revelation. I reached into my briefcase again and placed a crisp legal document directly next to the dossier. I laid out my final terms. I am giving you two options, I stated coldly. Choice 1 is the document sitting right there. It is an ironclad binding, non-disclosure and severability agreement. You will completely relinquish any right to interfere in my life. You will legally disown me. You will never contact me. You will never come near me, and you will never attempt to lay claim to a single cent of this estate. If you all sign this and vanish from my life forever, I will pay the legal fees to hire the best white-collar defense attorneys in Seattle to reduce Colin's sentence. I will ensure Brittany does not spend the rest of her life completely bankrupt. I tapped the glass table. Choice 2 is you refuse. I walk out that door. I leave Colin to rot under the maximum federal sentence. I leave Brittany to face the SEC auditors completely alone. And I leave you, Richard, and Patricia to drown in the millions of dollars of offshore debt Colin just anchored to your names. Patricia lunged for the table, sobbing hysterically, begging Richard to sign it. Brittany reached for the pen, her hands shaking with desperate urgency, knowing this was her absolute only lifeline. She looked at the $50 million valuation and then looked at the pen, her survival instinct temporarily overriding her pride. But Richard intercepted them. He snatched the pen away from Brittany's hand. His toxic, towering arrogance, the same narcissistic pride that had terrorized me since childhood, simply could not handle the reality of the situation. The idea of $50 million sitting directly in front of him, controlled by the daughter he had spent a lifetime treating like garbage, completely shattered his fragile ego. He grabbed the heavy legal agreement off the glass table, his face twisted into a snarl of supreme, unearned authority. He ripped the thick paper directly in half, then tore it into quarters, throwing the shredded pieces onto the floor. "You have $50 million!" Richard roared, his voice shaking with absolute rage as he pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. "I am your father. Under the law, I have the right to drag this estate into probate court and sue you for my rightful share. I do not need your charity, and I will not be blackmailed by my own blood. I will take what is mine." I looked down at the shredded paper scattered across the Persian rug. I looked at Patricia and Brittany, whose faces had drained of all color, realizing Richard had just destroyed their only chance at salvation. And then I looked back at the sheer blinding arrogance radiating from my father's eyes. I tilted my head back and laughed. It was a loud, genuine, and chilling sound that echoed off the mahogany walls, wiping the fury right off Richard's face and replacing it with sudden, creeping dread. I stopped laughing and met his gaze, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "I have been waiting for you to say that all afternoon," I said. "See you in court." The crisp evening breeze hit my face the moment I stepped out of the country club. The air was clean, a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of the VIP suite I had just left behind. I took a deep breath, letting the silence of the manicured courtyard wash over me. My town car was waiting at the end of the circular driveway. The driver was already stepping out to open the door for me. I had almost reached the vehicle when the heavy oak doors of the main entrance burst open with a violent crash. The frantic, erratic clicking of high heels echoed sharply across the pavement. I stopped and turned around slowly. Brittany was sprinting toward me. The golden child of the Hayes family, the woman who had spent her entire life cultivating an image of untouchable aristocratic perfection, was completely falling apart. Her designer blazer was wrinkled and askew. Her immaculate hair was a tangled, disheveled mess. She was hyperventilating, gasping for air as she scrambled across the courtyard. "Kelsey, wait!" she screamed, her voice cracking with pure panic. "Please, you have to wait!" She did not slow down as she reached me. Instead, her legs completely gave out. Brittany collapsed onto the hard, cold stone right at my feet. She threw her arms forward, wrapping them tightly around my lower legs. She buried her face against my knees, sobbing with a feral, undignified desperation that made the nearby valet attendants freeze in absolute shock. The favorite daughter was groveling in the dirt. "You have to help us!" Brittany wailed, her fingers digging frantically into the fabric of my trousers. Please, Kelsey, I am begging you on my hands and knees. You have $50 million. You are rich. You can fix all of this. You can pay off Colin's syndicate debts before they kill him. You can save my interior design boutique. You can save Mom and Dad's house. We are family. We are sisters. You cannot just walk away and let us be destroyed. I will do anything you want. I will apologize for everything I ever did to you. Just please write the check and save us. I stood perfectly still. I looked down at the weeping, pathetic woman clinging to my ankles. For 3 decades, she had belittled my existence. She had mocked my career, ridiculed my clothes, and stood by laughing while our parents treated me like a disposable servant. She had reveled in my misery and paraded her fraudulent wealth in my face at every opportunity. Now, stripped of her husband's stolen money and our parents' protective arrogance, she was utterly powerless. I searched my heart for a single ounce of pity. I found absolutely nothing. There was only a cold, clinical detachment. I reached down and firmly grabbed her wrists. With one swift, decisive motion, I peeled her trembling fingers off my legs. I took a deliberate step backward, forcing her to support her own weight on the rough pavement. "Save your boutique," I asked, my voice slicing cleanly through her hysterical sobs. "Save Mom and Dad's mansion." You really are completely oblivious to how the real world operates, Brittany. You think Colin was just a bad gambler. You think you are all just tragic victims of unfortunate circumstances. You think a massive check is a magic wand that can rewind time and erase your profound stupidity. Brittany looked up at me, her chest heaving, mascara running in thick black rivers down her pale cheeks. She was searching my face for a lifeline, a shred of sisterly affection that simply did not exist. "Let me explain the exact reality of your situation," I continued, enunciating every word with glacial precision. 6 months ago, when your interior design firm first defaulted on its commercial leases, your creditors panicked. They realized you were a massive financial liability. When Colin took out that predatory second mortgage on the family estate to cover his offshore losses, the bank immediately flagged it as toxic, unrecoverable debt. The financial institutions wanted to offload those liabilities as fast as humanly possible before your entire house of cards collapsed. Brittany swallowed hard, her jaw trembling violently. "So they sold that debt," I stated, maintaining absolute, unyielding eye contact. "Someone swooped in and bought all of it for pennies on the dollar. A private equity firm bought the commercial lease to your storefront. They bought the overdue invoices from your contractors. And they bought the exclusive holding rights to the second mortgage on Richard and Patricia's sprawling estate. Do you remember the name of the firm that holds your absolute ruin in their hands, Brittany?" She stopped crying. Her breath hitched in her throat as a new profound terror began to wash over her features. She knew the name. She had been dodging their aggressive certified foreclosure warnings for weeks. "Aegis," Brittany whispered, her voice barely audible over the evening breeze. "Aegis Capital." "Yes, Aegis Capital," I replied, a slow, devastating smile spreading across my face. "It is a very aggressive, very quiet holding company. I established it 18 months ago using the initial seed funding from David's tech incubator. I am the sole founder, the majority shareholder, and the chief executive officer of Aegis Capital." Brittany completely stopped breathing. She remained paralyzed on her knees, staring at me as if I were a ghost. Her mind visibly shattered as she realized the horrifying truth. The faceless, ruthless corporate entity she had been terrified of, the shadowy firm she had been hiding from, was actually me. I had not just been ignoring their downward spiral for the past year. I had been systematically, legally buying the very ground beneath their feet. I owned her debt. I owned her failures. I owned her entirely. I reached into my leather briefcase. I pulled out 3 thick, laminated legal documents. They were protected in clear plastic sleeves, pristine and ready for execution. I dropped the heavy packets onto the cobblestones, letting them land directly in front of Brittany's bruised knees. "Those are 3 court-ordered asset seizure and foreclosure mandates," I stated, my voice echoing across the courtyard with total finality. "They were signed by a federal bankruptcy judge at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. Aegis Capital is officially calling in the debts. As of this exact second, your interior design boutique, your frozen corporate bank accounts, and the sprawling mansion our parents are currently sitting in legally belong to me. Brittany let out a suffocated, broken wheeze. She reached out with a shaking hand, staring at the bold blue ink of the judge's signature visible through the plastic sleeve. The reality of her absolute destruction was no longer a threat, it was a legally binding fact. You have exactly 24 hours to gather whatever pathetic personal belongings you can carry and get off my property, I said, turning my back on her and pulling open the door of my waiting town car. If any of you are still inside my house by tomorrow morning, I will have you arrested for trespassing. The power of quiet independence. The dramatic unraveling of the Hayes family illustrates a profound truth about toxic dynamics. True security and self-worth are forged through quiet independence, not by seeking validation from those who fundamentally disrespect you. For decades, the family operated on a hierarchy that rewarded arrogance and punished genuine effort. They prioritized hollow appearances over substance, elevating a favored child, while marginalizing the one person quietly building a foundation of reality. The inherent danger in this dynamic is that entitlement is incredibly fragile. Building a life dependent on the approval of toxic individuals or fraudulent wealth leaves you entirely vulnerable to their inevitable collapse. When the Hayes facade finally shattered, those who relied on unearned privilege and manipulation were left with absolutely nothing to stand on. The protagonist's journey offers a powerful counter-narrative. She demonstrates that the most effective response to chronic belittlement is not to argue your worth, but to silently build an undeniable reality. While her family wasted their energy on petty cruelties, maintaining their status, and playing destructive games, she channeled her pain into tangible success. She did not beg for a seat at a table that constantly undermined her. Instead, she built her own empire from the ground up. This highlights that profound healing often requires walking away from the desperate need for closure or apologies from people who are fundamentally incapable of offering them. The ultimate triumph in the story is not merely the financial ruin of the antagonists, but the protagonist's unshakable self-reliance that renders their judgment completely irrelevant. Reclaim your own narrative today by investing your energy into your personal growth, rather than seeking approval from those who refuse to see your worth.